hit 2:04 p.m. here in Eastern Standard Time, I'd like to get started. Thank you so much, and hello and welcome to this live webinar for Canadian media organizations and journalists and stakeholders presented by Reporters Without Borders. We're really pleased to have you join us this afternoon. Before we begin today, I'd like all of us to take a moment to reflect on our gratitude and appreciation for the land on which we joined this call from. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the contemporary Niagara region, which is the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, and is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. As we speak about the future of journalism today, we continue to reaffirm our commitments to upholding truth and reconciliation and the 94 calls to action. As contemporary stewards of this land, we meet today in recognition of the power of journalism to empower, enlighten, and communicate the experiences of the diverse Indigenous peoples and communities we share this land with. So my name is Midge St. Hilaire. I'm Reporters Without Borders Regional Officer in Canada. And of course, today we have a great event planned for you. We have an initial presentation of RSF's Journalism Trust Initiative. We have a keynote speech from media scholar and academic Colette Brin, and we have an amazing panel discussion coming up with some esteemed journalists later, so you'll definitely not want to miss that. But in this first presentation, I really want to talk to you about this JTI, this tool that RSF has created, which we say enhances the competitive advantage of high quality media outlets worldwide. So I want to introduce you to the Journalism Trust Initiative. But first, I think, I'll give you a little refresher of what RSF does. I think most of you who are here, you're journalists, you're in the media industry, so you'll be familiar with RSF. But just as a quick overview, RSF is the foremost organization which is at the forefront of defending and promoting freedom of information around the world. Our work is really based on the belief that every human being has the right to reliable information, and this information informs their freedom of opinion and expression, which is codified in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you can see on the map on screen, our advocacy and representative work is accomplished via our bureaus worldwide in our network of over 150 correspondents in more than 130 countries. So it's quite a substantial network. And of course, we're consultative organizations in bodies such as the UN and the Council of Europe as well. So some of our work, it covers a range of activities, but you can see on the screen, we do everything from advocacy to field interventions to major initiatives aimed at updating international law around right to information and journalism. Our daily activities are premised around informing about the global press freedom situation. We report in that in 5 languages, as well as we report on censorship and abuses against journalists worldwide. We also lead initiatives to provide guarantees for the freedom of opinion and expression, fight against censorship, provide training and capacity building for journalists, conduct mobilization campaigns aimed at citizens and leaders, support journalists in legal action, ensure journalists in higher risk areas, and much more actually. So overall, what we do is our work is all about mitigating and reducing attacks against the freedom of information worldwide and essentially increasing the capacity of citizens to access high quality information. One of our flagship initiatives, I would say this along with the Journalism Trust Initiative, is the Press Freedom Index, again, something you all are likely aware of. And the index is where we measure and compare the level of freedom and openness enjoyed by journalists and media organizations from 180 countries around the world. And you can see, unfortunately, by the map that's on the screen, there are a lot of darker colors, which indicate that there is problematic or difficult situations in a specific country. And we did note that in our 2024 index, which we released earlier this year, that only 25% of countries globally do unfortunately have conditions which are satisfactory for producing and practicing journalism. Now, when we turn to Canada and we talk about Canada in the 2024 index, we're actually the best performing country in the Americas for press freedom, and we're ranked number 14 worldwide. But as we all know, if we're attending this call, there are still persistent challenges facing the industry and Canadian media in particular. So while we did move up 1 place from last year, our overall score, you can see there, the 81.7 did decrease from 2023. And what really stood out to me is the decline in economic and social indicators. So I think the social indicator, it captures quite effectively the reduced and decline in trust that we all have faced and that has been measured consistently across multiple surveys. Where the economic indicator, I think it captures the continued difficulties around business model and the erosion of revenues that traditional business models are facing. So while there are a lot of positives, and we definitely need to be appreciative of those, there are worrying signs as well. And we do need to take those into account in order to, again, going back to the title of this event, succeed in the future. And this is where the Journalism Trust Initiative comes in. It's something that we say is not a silver bullet. It's not going to, drastically do 180 on a situation, but it is a tool in the toolbox which can contribute to these beneficial outcomes and can contribute overall, to creating a more sustainable model for a specific media organization or participating media organizations. So we know that the challenges that we just touched on are not being faced just in Canada. So it's growing mistrust, it's declining revenues, changing business models, rise of these non-traditional influencers and platforms, the spread of myths and disinformation, the inability to differentiate types of content to determine quality, and the dominance of algorithms we know are all trends which are challenging this industry globally. And particularly over the last decade, many of these have become particularly salient, which has obviously, as we all know, created some issues. And this is where we enter the JTI. Again, as an organization with a global scope, we really believe that RSF has a role to play in alleviating some of the challenges, and at least being a productive role in, creating a more sustainable outcome for media organizations. So what the JTI is, if I can put it down into a couple sentences, is it's a regulatory mechanism developed as a market solution to safeguard and reward the production and distribution of high quality, ethical, and trustworthy news content. So really fundamentally, it's an international standard of best practices for the production of journalistic content and the operations of a journalistic organization. So essentially what it is, it's a framework of that's based around 18 criteria and 130 questions, 80 of which are mandatory for media organizations to follow to meet the highest standards of transparency and rigorous production of news based on journalistic principles. It's also a tool which evaluates compliance and adherence to international best practices and a method to recognize media organizations which meet and exceed recommended standards of trustworthiness and transparency. It can be used by media organizations to measure their internal processes, see what's going good, see what can be improved upon, gauge opportunities again for improvement, and make those necessary changes, because it does provide a framework in terms of best practices that organizations which are producing journalistic content should fulfill. So this slide, you see there's benefit. We talk about the benefits from both a media outlet perspective and a stakeholder, so regulator policymaker perspective. I'll touch on the second group a little bit later, but what I want to say here is that the JTI is really a simple, but it's also a robust framework to measure the compliance with the most important considerations that media organizations need to take into account in 2024 and going forward. It's also something that allows media to celebrate their high quality operations and news production, both internally and externally. It's a good news story that can be shared again with both internal, external stakeholders, that one, we're not afraid to be transparent. Two, we're proud to be operating based on these international standards. And three, if we're not operating there, we have a commitment and goal to get there. And all of this is due to serve our audience, our readers, the citizens writ large. And essentially, what the standard does is it differentiates media organizations which are committed to operating based on the international standard and those which are not. So I think, when we talk about benefits, if your media organization is interested in differentiating yourself from others in all different types of forums with different stakeholders, particularly when we talk from the funding perspective, the JTI is something that, it's really easy to complete, it's easy to speak on, and it's something that can give you a little leg up as well. The participating organizations can use the JTI as a tool to enhance their credibility for key stakeholders. Again, this is an international initiative. I'll talk about how it was created in the next slide. But this is something that, it's not coming from a third party or someone with a special interest. This is coming from, a non-governmental organization, and it's an international standard. And it also provides branding advantages, again, going back to differentiation and enhancing the credibility, which can, again, really lead to that advantage in funding, which I think is really important for media organizations these days. And then I always really emphasize its role as an internal benchmarking tool as well. I mean, I touched on that the JTI can be, once the transparency report has been completed, it can be shared internally. But this is also something which, again, particularly for smaller media organizations, new startup media organizations, this is a framework that's already established that they can essentially use to look, okay, we need editorial guidelines. Okay, here's an example of them. We can start on those and then continue to develop them. So we essentially are doing some of the work for media organizations and helping them understand, where there are gaps, what they could be doing better, etc. And again, these are based on the international recommendations. But again, how do we know that it's an objective international standard? So we need to look back at the creation and the genesis of the JTI. So again, how the JTI started was after initial internal brainstorming and development. But then we convened over 130 media stakeholders. So that's journalists, media organizations, representatives from the tech industry, ad industry, policymakers, regulatory bodies, and industry groups. And these stakeholders came from 6 continents. I'm not sure the number of countries, but it was significant. So, this is something, it's not an initiative with a Eurocentric perspective. It's something where we, again, based on our international mandate, we did consult international stakeholders from all different areas and all different aspects in order to create this standard. So we convened these working groups over a year and a half where the groups discussed and debated the key elements of a universal standard for responsible and high quality journalism. I always compare it to chocolate. So similar to when we talk about fair trade chocolate, there needs to be specific ingredients and there needs to be specific processes for chocolate to be considered fair trade. We tried to do the same to define what needs to go into journalism for it to be high quality. So what are the ingredients? What are the processes that go into journalism to make it high quality? And we created this final standard based on the 18 key criteria and published it in late 2019 via the European Committee for Standardization as an ISO, which stands for International Standard Organization. So it's the foremost international standard in the world. And it's essentially a global standard for the production of goods and services, journalists, of course, being a service. If you have any, if you're interested to see who participated or the full workshop agreement, it is available on our website. So feel free to have a look, journalismtrustinitiative.com, or I'm happy to chat after this and I can share it with you directly. So who's involved right now? 4 years later, the JTI is the foremost international standard codifying the key requirements of ethical and high quality journalism. Consistent with our global mandate, we have over 1,800 media outlets from more than 85 countries participating in the initiative. Some participating media you might know are on the screen, but we have a full or quite a significant list on, again, our website, journalismtrustinitiative.com/community, if you want to have a look. And we are also very grateful for CBC News, Radio Canada, and the Winnipeg Free Press, who were our first 3 organizations in Canada to both complete, publish, and have their transparency report certified. So big kudos to them. But we're growing quite significantly. We received a couple of transparency reports in recent weeks. So it's really great to see the participation increasing in Canada. And we hope through events like this and with future outreach that some of you may be hearing from myself or other colleagues, we hope that more media organizations will adopt the JTI or at least be aware of the framework and the standard and hopefully it can be useful. So how does it actually work? I talked about kind of the high level, but let's go a bit to the granular and talk about how the process of the JTI. And it is actually quite straightforward. So it's a 3-step process. First is measuring the organization you represent, the media organization, against the JTI criteria by completing what we call a transparency report / self-assessment. So this is an assessment of, again, based on the criteria and the questions within the report. This is an assessment of your activities, your operations, your editorial standards, etc. Once you've completed the 80 mandatory questions in the report, you can publish the results online and share the link with key stakeholders. And then media which have self-assessed themselves compliant with the JTI standard can initiate another optional third-party audit to certify their compliance with the JTI standard based on, of course, international best practices of transparency and journalism production. So when we talk about the self-evaluation, the report itself, which can be filled out online on jtiapp.com if you want to go on and have a look right now, is comprised of 130 questions, most of which are yes or no. So I always say that this report, not only is it free to sign up on the JTI app to complete the to complete the transparency report and to publish the transparency report. But to actually complete this entire transparency report, it takes about 1 hour to 1 hour and a half. So it's not a big time commitment. There is no cost to it. So we believe that there is not significant barriers to entry for the JTI initiative. Again, another plus that we always share. So we always divide, or I always divide the standard into two key pillars, which you can see on screen are the operational standards and editorial standards. And these two pillars capture the 18 criteria which make up the ultimate JTI standard. So if you think of the transparency report, it's divided into 18 sections, which are the criteria, and those 18 sections altogether make up 130 questions, which again, most are yes or no questions. So operational standards define transparency and openness of an organization by measuring whether an organization has publicly disclosed information such as ownership, management team, sources of revenue. And then editorial standards, of course, quite straightforward, look at how media organizations produce their news. So what are the editorial guidelines? How does an outlet deal with accountability and corrections? How does an organization train its staff? How does an org work with sources, etc.? So to get started, and I guess if you're completely new to this process, you would of course make an account on the JTI app. So the link is on the screen there, and I'll put a QR code in a couple slides. But you can log on there, scroll down to the section where it says create an account, where you can create an account. And all you need to provide is to sign up is the name of your media outlet, your first name, your last name, your email, password, and then click the boxes at the bottom. And please note that both this website and Journalism Trust Initiative website are available in 10 languages, including both of Canada's official languages. So if you feel more comfortable in another language, please have a look at that as well. So once you have created an account, as you saw on the last slide, you can use the credentials which you created, so the email and the password, to sign up, to log in on the JTI app. Once you log in, this is the workspace where you'll see this. This is where you complete the transparency report. So you can see the progress of the transparency report if it still needs to be completed, as well as you can see the stage of the JTI lifecycle. And then once the transparency report is published, then you can have the link of the report there as well. So here's an example of the questionnaire. As I mentioned, most of these are yes or no questions. You can add notes if you would like to provide more information, and know that these notes actually don't become public. So for example, if you start the self-assessment, but then another colleague takes over, then notes could be helpful just to indicate certain things that you were filling it out. Here's an example of a mandatory question, which you can see the denotation of the little star beside the question mark. So again, mandatory questions, they need to be answered in the affirmative if an organization wants to move on to the next stage of certification. And they also need to be answered in the affirmative if a transparency report is to be published. But yeah. So if we talk about like the next step, once you complete the transparency report, it's about the public disclosure. So this is where you can review and publish the report that you've completed in the JTI app workspace. Once you've done that, it will create both an online link and a PDF. So there will actually be an online address as well as a PDF that you can download and print out and share with key internal and external stakeholders. And also, I think it's important to note that the report can be edited anytime within the JTI app workspace. So you can go back and edit it if anything changes, or if you do become into compliance with some of the requirements. And I do, again, want to underscore that it is always free to make an account on the JTI app, and it's always free to complete the transparency report, and it's always free to publish the transparency report. When we talk about the final stage, which is the certification, there is a cost to that, just because the auditor does need to compensate their staff for the time and the resources needed. And essentially how the certification works is it brings in a third-party auditor. So you can see our global auditing partners on the screen there. And what the auditor does is it reviews and verifies the information provided in your self-attestation in the transparency report that your organization completed. So usually the auditor will request information and documents to verify your self-assessment, and will confirm whether internal processes recommended by the JTI standard are codified and enforced. Generally, as you can see, it takes about 2 to 3 months total. And how it works is usually if you want to proceed with that step, we would work together, reach out to the auditor for a quote of the cost. Generally, as I said, generally there is a cost. Well, always there is a cost, and generally the cost is up to 5,000 US dollars, but it does differ depending on the size of the organization and the information required. But I think it's also important to note that the certification is effective and available for 2 years. So once you do complete the certification, you have a 2-year period where that certification is valid. The value of the certification is really an objective measure of the compliance with these international best practices. And it also provides, again, optimum credibility and differentiation, as a media organization can say that they're fully compliant with the JTI international standard based on a third-party view of that. Additionally, we also license the JTI logo to certified media for use as an indicator of quality journalism regulatory compliance. And that's something, we continue to work on internally, just, making the JTI logo more well-known as, again, as an indicator of quality, not only for media organizations and journalists, but also consumers and our readers as well. So before I share some case studies on how the JTI has been used internationally and among some other stakeholders, I'll just give you a minute. I have the QR code on screen. Feel free to scan the QR code, have a look at the JTI app website, and make an account for your organization. If you have any questions, you can send me an email or you can put a comment in the chat and I can follow up with you afterwards. And the address is jti-app.com. So hope to see some new signups and yeah, if you have any questions, definitely happy to follow up. But when we talk about the JTI as a whole, of course, it's very beneficial for media organizations, but we believe that it has benefit and it has proven to be beneficial for a media ecosystem and a media landscape overall in specific jurisdictions. So now the JTI, for almost 5 years, the JTI has become the foremost international standard of best practice for the production of journalism. And while we continue to grow that network, again, we're really close to 2,000. We want to work to let audiences and consumers understand the importance of the regulated production of news content. And we have seen some notable successes in terms of injecting the JTI into policy conversations and working with key global stakeholders. So I think one of our key successes that we always talk about, and, really since the beginning, we've engaged with the European Union and the European Commission and just national and regulatory bodies worldwide to share this international standard for the production of journalism. And we've held numerous consultations and conversations with the EC in particular. So one of the key milestones for the JTI, it was last year actually, was its inclusion in the first European legislation on media freedom, which is aptly named the European Media Freedom Act. And what this legislation does is one of the things as it relates to the JTI is that it identifies the JTI as a key benchmark for identifying and designated media, which are complying with standards of editorial independence, ethics, and transparency. And with this legislation, JTI certified media are designated as providing reliable online journalistic information and protected from arbitrary moderation and content deletion from leading platforms that you can all imagine. And essentially, the goal of the legislation is to mitigate the current information chaos and the proliferation of misinformation, narrow the scope of non-compliant media channels, and clearly designate reliable media so that it reduces the work of platform companies. And it actually gets them to moderate those organizations or those channels, I guess, that do need to be moderated. The JTI was also the only tool explicitly named as an indicator of reliable news and information sources in the EU's Code of Practice on Disinformation, which was submitted along with the EU's Digital Services Act in 2022, and which helps platform companies adhere to standards which combat disinformation. So the inclusion of the JTI in this code presented as a tool which platform companies, regulators, policymakers, and stakeholders across the board could use to determine content regulation, moderation, and enforcement processes. So again, we have the framework available, and we always like to say that this is something that can inform the policy that you're creating already, or that it can inform, yeah. So we've also had additional discussion, and these are just some of many that we've had. Again, we're in over 80 countries, but we've also had additional discussions across the globe. So just talking about, 2 other continents plus another European country. So in Colombia, there are ongoing discussions on a new law to finance media outlets, and the JTI has been adopted as a reference instrument, which can filter organizations which will benefit from this organization. In Malaysia, a new independent media council has been established this year, which goal is to establish and harmonize standards related to Malaysian media. And the JTI has been used as an example of international recommendations for journalism standards and will inform actually the final criteria established by the Media Council. In Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, the National Media Support and Development Agency are interested in adopting the JTI as a criteria by which it provides funding. And in Austria, the National Media Regulatory Body has announced that media matching a prescribed quality criteria will have access to 10% more public funding than previously, which is an example of a jurisdiction which is putting quality incentives in place to encourage transparency and media quality control. So I think finally, just quickly, we've also made efforts to connect with industry and share the win-win benefits of the JTI. So last year, we signed an MOU with Microsoft to address shared concerns about the major threats that our information space faces. The collaboration involves sharing data regarding media outlets that have completed the transparency report and been certified with Microsoft. Microsoft will then integrate this data into its algorithms across its suite of products to elevate the results and content of news organizations which are participating in the JTI or JTI certified. Following the signing of this agreement last year, we've had pilot projects for data integration and algorithmic amplification taking place on Bing, Microsoft search engine. And there's other pilot projects that have recently begun and others that will begin imminently on other Microsoft platforms as well. So looking out for that, and we're always interested in collaborating with other platforms to see what's possible. So this was just a mini overview of the JTI and the multi-stakeholder benefits it can provide. As I hope was demonstrated, participation and engagement with the standard does lead to tangible branding and funding advantages for media. It enhances the provided participating newsrooms and raises the overall standard of journalism in Canada and across the world. For regulators, the JTI is an already established standard informed based on a robust process of consultations, which can be used to identify best practices in the production of journalism. For platforms, the JTI is an opportunity to elevate the quality of content, reduce their risks, and contribute to the overall health of the information ecosystem. And yeah, the JTI it's really been a compelling offering for media and stakeholders around the globe, and we really hope to continue building our network in Canada further. If you have any questions, happy to jump on a call, happy to email back and forth. But I think, our goal here was just to make folks aware of the JTI and hopefully get more media participating in the JTI as well. But thank you again for your time. This concludes the first section of today's program. And we will turn now to our keynote speaker. So I'd now like to turn to our keynote speaker who's just come on screen. Hello, Colette. Good afternoon. Merci d'être ici. Many of you likely know of Colette already. She's currently a full professor and the directrice of the Centre d'études sur les médias at Université Laval. She leads the work on Canada's country page for Reuters' annual digital news report, and she's the chair of the Independent Advisory Board on Eligibility for Journalism Tax Measures. And she's a former journalist, and I probably missed something. So quite a busy person, as the panelists coming up are as well. Her work and background really makes her a key observer for the ongoing changes that are facing Canadian media and are facing media worldwide. As chair of the advisory board, she assesses criteria which inform the designation of qualified Canadian journalism organizations, which are engaged in the production of original general interest news content on an ongoing basis, which hire journalists on a regular basis and do not produce a significant amount of content promoting or covering an organization, an association, or its members. That was a mouthful. Her current academic research is exploring the use of AI in newsrooms and the implication this has for trust. So now I'm going to stop talking, and Colette will share her thoughts on some of these ongoing trends, as well as potential threats and opportunities for Canadian media over the next decade. So without further ado, Colette, thank you very much. And yeah, please begin.
Thank you, Mitch. Very glad to be with you today. And it was really great to get some updates on the JTI, which I was familiar with, but I hadn't heard recent news. So really useful there. Je vais parler en anglais, mais évidemment, ma langue maternelle est le français. Alors, vous m'excuserez de ne pas toujours m'exprimer au mieux. So I've offered to talk today about the idea of supporting journalism. And when I talk about supporting journalism, I mean actually the government getting involved in supporting journalism in a changing media ecosystem. So it's not my role. I'm not, well, yes, I guess I am a government advisor in my role as chair of the advisory board, but I do tread with some caution here because I am held to a certain discretion regarding the work of the board. I wish to acknowledge the work of the other members of the board. There are 7 of us now, and also the CRA Journalism Secretariat, which assists us in this important work and has been doing so since 2020. We started during the pandemic. And I guess if we're talking about government support, we have to start with the obvious question, which is, should governments even be doing this? Isn't there a danger in governments getting involved in funding journalism? And you know, a way to get around that is exactly what Mitch was describing, which would be an independent process to assess eligible organizations. And that's what the QCJO is set out to be. It does work a little differently than the JTI certification. So it doesn't rely entirely, I mean, you can't opt out of the independent assessment. You have to go through that process. And it has been a challenge, and we have seen some cases that have not crossed that bar. And, we have had important discussions about where that bar should be set and considering different capacities and different missions of different types of news organizations. For example, smaller organizations that serve really specific communities, but if they weren't there, nobody would be serving this community. So we do take that into consideration. But just to cite one of my colleagues, Bob Cox, who used this expression at a very recent meeting a couple of days ago, we're looking at media that are doing community examination and not community celebration. So a challenge sometimes we see in the cases before us are a lot of, light promotional news, sponsored or not. But that tends to be, talking about really positive things happening in the community, new businesses opening up, really great stuff happening, but that's not journalism. And we see that we assume that some of these business owners who are starting these startups, or sometimes they're very established organizations, don't seem to know what journalism is. So listening to Mitch earlier, I was wondering if there would be some way to perhaps, make them a little bit more aware of the JTI process. It's certainly not our role, and it's not the CRA's role to communicate with these people to tell them, well, there's this, this benchmarking process you could go through. But our work really looks at the content. We couldn't just satisfy ourselves with the policies and the processes, because we have seen organizations that have these really nice looking editorial policies, but when you look at the content, it's not exactly what's going on. So we really have to look at a sample of content, and it's typically 3 weeks for a publication, be it digital or print, that publishes content on a daily basis. And just to get back to that idea, should governments even be doing this? I was just looking at the map, as you all were a few minutes ago, the World Press Freedom Map, and I would, at the risk of being a little cheeky here, I would recommend that we look for inspiration to those countries that are green on the map, and maybe not those countries that are orange in terms of media freedom. But I understand concerns regarding perceptions of editorial independence, that kind of thing. I think we've been effective in avoiding those problems, but you can't fight perceptions for sure. So I'm just looking at my notes here so I don't go over time. So there has been research on programs like the Local Journalism Initiative, which actually funds directly jobs for journalists in underserved communities. What's come out of this research is that this program has been designed really to support organizations, not so much the needs of the communities that they're serving. and they tend to focus on a quantitative evaluation of the number of stories being produced and not so much of the value of that content. And you can understand why that's being done. I can certainly relate. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, an independent audit of the tax credit system, which I work with. But there has been a study done in the US, and I will provide links for this, for both of these studies, showing that tax credits, as designed in Canada, have had a low impact on subscriptions. There is a tax credit for digital news subscriptions, but the authors of the study suggest that people should be getting the credit or the discount at the point of sale rather than a year later when they do their tax return. And that sounds reasonable to me, but I'm not a tax lawyer, so I don't know how that would work. And of course, we don't know, or it's hard to tell whether these measures have really helped to stave off the collapse of newsrooms. We're seeing still lots of layoffs, and we can only imagine that it could be worse if these measures weren't in place. But and I always ask myself, what impact is this having on the audience? Are people exposed to news? Are they reading news? Are they, it's the idea of, okay, you're building this forest, or you're building this house in the forest, but if nobody's there to see it, what's it for? And of course, in the past year, with C18 coming into effect, now the Online News Act, it's much more difficult to access news online for people who tend to be more passively exposed to news. So that's the kind of research I'm really involved in, is audience research. So as Mitch mentioned, my research center actually supervises the Canadian report, not just the country page in the Reuters report. So we do analysis of the Canadian data for the digital news report. And we also look at how it compares to other countries. And we've seen that, yes, news consumption on Facebook has declined in the past year, but it actually started declining way before. And the trend, we're seeing the same trend in most other countries. And even media organizations like the BBC are saying they're turning away from Facebook as a source of viewers, because it's just not an optional space for them. So we can debate the merits of C18. I think it's still early days. It certainly hasn't yielded the benefits that were hoped for at this point, but we should keep in mind that the fact that people are moving away from certain platforms for news, or that certain platforms, social media platforms, are actually becoming really problematic in terms of news consumption. And I think that the panel will be discussing maybe a little bit more what this means also for business models for media organizations. So Mitch told you about the criteria. The biggest one we deal with is the production of original news content. So we're looking for organizations that are engaged in the production of what we call ONC on an ongoing basis. So we're not looking for bits and pieces here and there. We're really looking for newsrooms that are actively covering news, that are not just aggregating or curating other media's content, that are covering a variety of topics, that they're not focused on, sports or entertainment or a specific industry, that the coverage includes coverage of democratic institutions and processes writ large, and that the content is based on journalistic processes and principles. And there's a document called the Guidance for the Income Tax Measures that's really detailed, that explains all of this stuff. It probably takes more than an hour to do an application, I'm sorry to say. And there is also the criteria of 2 journalists regularly employed by the organization at arm's length. The arm's length requirement was taken out for C18. And the idea that, actually journalists can actually be business owners and still be editorially independent. So I think that's really up for discussion. And the last one, which is rarely controversial in the cases we look at, is that the organization should not have 20% of its content covering an association, an organization, or its members, or regarding a government, crown corporation, or government agency. So that doesn't happen very often, but it has come up on occasion. So just maybe my bird's eye view of the current challenges in the industry. We're seeing these positions of LJI reporters that are coming that are not stable. They're they hire people for a year, sometimes 2 years, and then they go away. So that doesn't resolve the issue. The fact that some of these small organizations really lack resources in editing and just the kind of innovative thinking that would require these organizations just to survive in the current climate. A lot of new businesses that are built on curation, aggregation of previously published content that are not really adding any value or any really original content, news or context to what they're publishing. And also, of course, news that has a point of view. So that's something that's come up a lot in our work, looking at news that does have a slant to it. And in many cases, the organization does make an effort to show other points of view, to give a right of reply. Say, if you're criticizing the government, you should have someone from government reach out to them and give them an opportunity to reply. This seems very basic to most journalists, but you would be surprised to see how many organizations do not do this or do not mention in their articles that they're doing this. But the fact that there's a point of view, that there's kind of a color in a news organization, we don't consider that to be problematic per se. So I'll leave to the next panel the discussion of C18. I just wanted to mention that fact about Facebook news consumption. I'm really concerned about audiences, especially younger audiences that are not consuming news proactively, that are really waiting for news to come to them, people who are not paying for news. How is it possible to keep producing news in a context where no one wants to pay for it? And I guess, there are legitimate questions that can be asked of these types of programs, like the tax credits, in terms of is it fostering innovation? Is it helping organizations actually consolidate their news capacity, their news production capacity? And as we're all going to be dealing in the next couple of years with the issue of generative AI and how that poses challenge in terms of producing news, in terms of restoring the audience's trust in the news. We're seeing in recent surveys that people are not that comfortable with AI being used in journalism, but it's still early, and I think that may actually evolve. So I'm just going to keep it at that. I think I may have gone a little bit over time, but thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Colette. There was a lot of really interesting strands that you shared there. So I thank you so much for joining us. And I went over time, so it's my fault. But yeah, I think now we can bring in our panel, and I'll just share my presentation again. So yeah, I think now we can bring in our panel after that those insights that Colette shared. And I think it's also really important to understand, better how Colette's committee works and what opportunities there are for media organizations as well. But yeah, I think we have a great panel set up to close this event. We have 4 great panelists who will discuss both how the organizations are dealing with the current trends and challenges facing Canadian media, but also kind of what they're anticipating maybe future trends, and what are some solutions they're using to alleviate some of those issues. So with that, I'll bring in our moderator, Brent Jolly, and I'll let Brent take it away. So Brent, please, and panelists, please come on screen as well. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much, Mitch. And I will be the one to keep it snappy and get us back on time here, I promise. Hi, everybody. My name is Brent Jolly. As Mitch said, I'm the president of the Canadian Association of Journalists. I'm also the managing director of the National News Media Council, which is the standards and regulatory, self-regulatory body, I should say, for non-broadcast news organizations. And I'll be guiding you through the last part of today's programming. I just want to start by saying, in today's days of shrinkflation, I think it's very rare that you often get a sniff of a second or even a third helping of really, really good information in one online event. But today's your lucky day. So I'm really glad to be here to supplement what some of the challenges and issues that Colette brought up in her excellent keynote with an equally exceptional group of industry experts who are here to help us address and explain some of the opportunities and also some of the challenges that that Colette expanded upon introduced in her keynote. Now, I think it's obviously not a secret of many of the challenges currently befalling the Canadian news media industry. You know, just like in many other countries around the world, Canadian news organizations are experiencing revenue shortfalls, historically inconsistent and imbalanced relationships with tech platforms, and a growing decline in trust with audiences. So it's today that, against that very sobering backdrop, that we're considering a prescient question, which is, how can Canadian journalism industry succeed in a post-C18 world? So, you know, no biggie there. Just to help us get going, we've brought in 4 really heavy hitters that I'm very pleased to introduce in no particular order. Discussing this question and other issues today is first Cheryl McKenzie, who is the Director of News and Current Affairs at APTN National News. Kenny Young is the Chief of Strategy and Staff with CBC News. Layla Savage is the founder and editor-in-chief at La Converse. And Ed Greenspan is the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. Welcome, everybody, and look forward to having a great talk with you. Now, before we begin today, I think, as we've set out, much of what we're trying to focus on today and discussing is very future-focused. And where do we go from here? At the same time, I think it's important for for everybody watching and tuning in on this to kind of understand a little bit the impacts that C18 of the Online News Act has had on publishers. And one of the major topics of conversation over the past year is Meta's blocking of news in Canada. And this is something that Colette mentioned in her opening remarks. So I'd like to start with that and ask each of the publishers here, so Kenny, Cheryl, Layla, if you could explain how this decision by Meta, for example, has had an impact on your news organization's relationship with your audiences. And are there other factors that we should be considering when evaluating the overall impact of the Online News Act? I'm gonna start that question with Cheryl, then go to Kenny, and then Layla, please.
Yeah, that was interesting, the comment from Colette about how the news viewership on Facebook was actually declining before Meta even banned news from their platform. I found that really interesting, so thank you for that piece. For as far as the Meta platforms, you know, on Facebook, you know, we have a sizable audience on Facebook for sure for our Indigenous news. The discoverability for APTN is really it is enhanced on those platforms, because there are some there's even Indigenous people in Canada that don't even know that APTN exists. We all know that the platforms out there have a lot of control over what people see, what is their algorithm for what they're seeing as they flip through their platforms. Are they going to be seeing small media, or what's seen as a small media news organization as APTN News? Yet APTN News is like the biggest platform for Indigenous news out there. Like, nobody can beat Indigenous APTN News in Indigenous content, because we have a whole television station, we have multiple platforms, we have daily newscasts, 2 of them every day, we have weekend newscasts, current affairs shows, an investigative program. We're mandated under the CRTC, yet still when we do a youth focus group and ask them, well, what are you seeing? They're saying, well, why don't you go on Twitter, or why don't you go on YouTube? And meanwhile, we are definitely on these platforms. So just the power of these platforms have over such a big organization like APTN is a little scary for sure. And I know there's a lot of other other descriptions out there for it. But at APTN, you know, we are an expression of our Indigenous identity. The work we do is an expression of Indigenous identity in Canada. And we just want as many people as possible to see those stories. So without these platforms, you know, like we do want the collaboration with others in the media and news industry. But I'll stop there to, you know, to give other people, I'm going on and on here.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Cheryl. Kenny, how are you finding, I mean, Cheryl mentioned the issue of discoverability and visibility and being in front of audiences and having them see the CBC brand as they scroll down their smartphone or on their tablet. You know, what kind of impact have you seen from the meta ban so far on CBC News?
Yeah, I think I mean, pick up on Cheryl and what Colette sort of said in her talk is you know, news dissemination or news distribution is so challenging these days. There's not just one place, right? Not just a newscast, not just a newspaper, not just a print stand. And I think that's the complexity that we hit as we hit the 2024 period. Scroll over to New York Times, where the headline there says Mark Zuckerberg is done to politics. Literally, it's a headline that they're publishing, which fundamentally says that one of the big platforms that created a whole generation or two relationship with how they consume media. So being intermediary between the human being through a mobile device to news, built up habits that were, you know, sort of generation forming. And from decisions based in 2019, 2021, and pulling away, that had an impact, right? So I think it's very true that the moves in C18 was not the result of the impacts we're feeling, that though that pullback was happening well before this period. So I think for us, it's always understanding that that relationship between any publisher, broadcaster, and their audience was kind of taken by these intermediaries. And I think that the challenging now is that we can't reset the clock, which is when you look at the generations, which 18 to 24, 24 to 35, even up to 50, when you rank them on the preferred modes of consumption where they connect with news, you will see the younger you go, it's the Facebook, Instagrams, Snapchats, and YouTubes. And then the older you go, you have live television, live radio, news websites. And I think it's that complexity that is not a monolith, and also that population that really has been using social and video platforms to connect with information have not adopting what they are the older generation. So what I would say is the Facebook wave had come already for the publishing industry. Much of the actual transaction between audience and landing on websites, whether it's news websites or broadcast websites, had declined. So that's a thing to track. They already had been turned off. The interesting one is Instagram. Instagram, where a very young population does live, breathe, where they do consume, and then having that shut off, I think was a really, I believe you're seeing the ripple effects of what's on that platform and how those young audiences are connecting. So I do think one of the challenging for us, future forward, is how the news organization and brands figure out how to be in those spaces and figure out how intermediaries, whether it's YouTube now and TikTok or streaming channels, are kind of the distribution points to content and how we sort of think about. We've learned a lot through the platform era where search and social created those relationships, and now we have an opportunity to rethink about those lessons learned and how we're smart about navigating this multiple distribution future that we're in.
Thanks, Kenny. Leila, it's kind of a slightly different, I feel like, art case study for you with La Converse, because, you know, these were the tools and the measures that were on the table when you began your business, you know, search and social, as Kenny was just saying. How has, you know, the kind of changing target, if you want to say that, had an effect on how people find content and journalism from La Converse over the past year or so?
It's been extremely challenging. So just some context, La Converse is a BIPOC-led media serving marginalized communities in French, now in both languages, French and English. And, you know, we're a small startup. So the way for us to get to be known is social media. That's how most digital startups will start today. And to build an audience, to be able to generate revenue through your audience, so to have people supporting your mission, is one tactic that's, I'll be honest, sold to many publishers like me, build audience engagement, create a newsletter, get people subscribed to your newsletter, ask them for money, hopefully they'll support you. That already was hard, given our market, given we're in Quebec, given, let's be honest, like there's not a huge culture of donation in Francophone spaces to begin with. And so adding to the fact that it is led by people of color, we are talking about those stories, which are not always very sexy to all of Canada, right? Building your brand with very few marketing dollars is extremely hard. So, social media has been our tool, not only for building our brand, building, our audience, but also for informing audiences. So we would actually do Instagram reporting, and some stories would only be on Instagram. So, we would cover protests on Instagram, and it really looked like our page was very much like a Humans of New York. So people recognized us through our Instagram page, and that became like the brand of La Converse. So we didn't care about how many clicks we got on our website because we don't do ads. So it was really more about getting the information to the communities we serve. And now that that's no longer available, we kind of lost direct contact with our community, so we'll write stories and then we're wondering, like, how do we make sure those stories are actually getting to the people we serve if we don't have that access, right? I mean, Cheryl mentioned it as well, but I mean, Indigenous communities are usually on Facebook, youth are usually on Instagram, so what's interesting to me is that, Facebook is removing news from their platform, but people are not leaving those platforms, right? So the people are still there. And interestingly, I think that we've been replaced by content creators. So like people still get news about what's going on in Gaza through content creators. People still, are getting some sort of information, but they're not done by journalists. And that's where I think I'll get into that later, but I think that's a big problem for democracy. The fact that there are no more journalists on social media, what is going to happen to Canadian society and Canadian democracy? So I'll end it there.
Good point, Leila. And I'll definitely follow up with you so we can hear about what your thoughts are on that. I want to move on to Ed here. Ed, as the grand poobah of the analysis of the Canadian media landscape here. I mean, one of the themes I think I'm hearing from Kenny, Leila, and Cheryl is the need to innovate, and being forced to innovate, perhaps even at warp speed, whether you have the answer or not. It's kind of, building the plane and learning to fly it at the same time. Can you zoom out a little bit and give us some thoughts and your analysis on how news organizations have innovated over the past decade, and have any of those measures taken hold?
Well, okay, let me go backwards a second. I just want to say something with the Facebook thing, but I'll put it in the context of innovation as well. And I'm just trying to get over the hurt of being a grand poobah where everybody else gets to be so dynamic. But in any case, I think what I'm hearing from people about Facebook, Meta, Instagram, its other properties, is lament that they're not in the business, or they're getting out of the business. And I think C18 obviously hasten that. I think they want to show the world here in Canada that they would punish if this happened. They would extract a penalty. But as Colette was saying, they have been getting out of the business, and they've been a very unreliable business partner for years before that, going back to at least 2016, if I remember correctly. They, overnight on a Saturday night changed their algorithm and cost various news organizations 30, 40, 50% of their traffic. So anybody who was exploiting that as a tool to use, good on them. Anybody who's relying on that as a business strategy, a sustainable business strategy, I don't think that was ever going to be in the cards as a business strategy. And I'm happy that Colette added some factual evidence in here, because a lot of the debate, a lot of the discussion around Facebook, and not from my colleagues on the panel, but over the past year and a half, has been, sometimes superficial, sometimes disingenuous, i.e., there's more money available before C18 than after C18, when that money that was available was only because of the specter of C18 in any case. So, I don't think that was a very good argument altogether. On innovation, it's interesting. Back to the shattered mirror days, which is, I guess, what makes me a grand poobah,
Yes.
because it was so long ago. And Colette was one of our principal, researchers, so one of the 4 principal researchers on that piece of work. But, we set out to say, okay, is the news media as we know it, as it was then, in a decline that will be difficult for democracy? And then the second question of 3 research questions was, if so, are new forms of digital media and digital communication filling that gap? Because if they were filling that gap, then there's no room for policy. And the third question was, if not, then, is there a role for policy, and how does that look like in the least intrusive manner possible? And the fact is, back then, there wasn't enough innovation. And the fact is, today, we don't really know if there's enough innovation, because it's not tracked easily enough. We can speak episodically about Layla's site, about other sites around. We can speak episodically about Village Media, which has started in a number of locations in Canada, smaller towns and cities. We can talk about legacy media like La Presse, which has been, if not one of the most innovative news organizations in North America among legacy organizations, and stopped printing in, I don't know, 2017, 2018, sometime in that, has built a news model, has built a business model on advertising, nonetheless, not on subscriptions. So, we see this, but I've been kind of trying to petition people for about 5 years. Let's get an inventory out there of what is happening in the innovative sector, because at the end of the day, that is the way news is going to get saved. And somebody's going to come along and think up a better idea, because somebody always comes along and thinks up a better idea. And commentators, poobahs like me, are not going to be the ones who come up with that idea. About 5 years after the fact, we'll recognize the person who did come up with it. So good work going on. Lots of people experimenting. That's how you get to innovation, with lots of people experimenting. But I don't think we really have a good sight line on what's happening out there.
And just based on some of the, as you've said, the anecdotal, examples, what are some of the things that you've seen that you think could be potentially instructive for other news outlets in terms of innovation?
Well, I think I'm seeing some people trying things on micro-local, some people hyper-local, some people trying to take back local. I think actually the next frontier for policy, if there is going to be another frontier from policy, which is fairly questionable, would be, what I'm talking about is relocalization. I mean, too much of local media has, I wasn't against chain ownership per se, but when the chains divorce themselves from the communities they're in terms of having editors and reporters and even ad salespeople in those communities, then you got a real problem. So I think, communities are going to have to take back their news, or entrepreneurs are going to, hopefully fill that gap and find resonance, because, news that's coming from 2,000 miles away is, not associated with the community. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of that, some green shoots, and that's great. We're seeing specialized publications in some ways, or maybe it's not specialized as much as targeted to audience segments, which is only makes sense in the kind of media environment that we have, where you can, identify and find, your segment. So I think there's some promise out there. Ultimately, and to Layla's point a couple of moments ago, it's about having journalists doing the work. And it's about having that kind of professional, repetitive, iterative, like stories don't come out of nowhere. Stories come out of the story before. and the next story and the next story, and then that shakes the trees, and then sources come forward, and this is how important stories break. And so you have to be at it day after day after day. You can't just be hobbyists, I don't think.
Thank you. Cheryl, I want to ask you next a little bit about innovation at APTN. I mean, we're obviously sort of pulling together some anecdotes here just around what's going on, but I think, you know, in many ways, APTN is innovative in and of itself by its very existence. You know, it's been almost 25 years now that it became the first national Indigenous broadcaster in the world. It's just recently launched APTN Languages, for example, with programming primarily being disseminated in Indigenous languages. Can you tell us how this, I don't want to say, call it a culture of innovation, applies to APTN's mandate with regards to news and current affairs and how it approaches that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary for APTN on September 1st, and then April 16th. This coming year will be the big 25 for our news program. So, like, right from the very start, you know, APTN had to innovate, even to exist. Like, APTN like struggled into existence. You know, we were the CRTC asked us to a meeting to talk about APTN's, you know, struggles and challenges, and I pointed out, well, we just need to look into the CRTC's archive and look at those interventions that were actually against APTN even existing. And so since then, we've had to really innovate and figure out, like, where, you know, what is the best way that we can deliver some great, informative, relevant news content to our audiences. And the biggest part is, like, having the people. We have to have those Indigenous journalists out there across the country, into the north. We are one of the few, maybe two, national broadcasters that can say that we're actually have bricks and mortar news bureaus in the north, like in the Yukon, in Northwest Territories, in Nunavut. So our reach is expansive, but we're really, really lean on the ground. Like, we have like one person in a home bureau here and there. I won't go into it here, it'll just take up too much time. But the innovation that we have to do, even to produce our 2 newscasts every day, to do our current affairs shows every day, to do our big digital media on aptnnews.ca, it really comes down to those journalists who are dedicated and really believe in what they do. Because if you're going to work at APTN, you know, you're not coming here because, you know, you're going to get, you know, loads of money and power and prestige. You know, it's because our journalists really believe in what they do. So we're constantly facing innovation to overcome the many challenges that get put in front of us because we are an Indigenous news broadcaster in Canada. You know, let's face it, not everybody's going to tune into APTN. There's a lot of people that are not interested in it. So how does APTN remain committed to its core purpose, but still grow our audiences and still grow the number of people who tune in? Because in order to earn the money, you know, we need some of that ad revenue. Right now, APTN's almost all of its revenue is coming from cable subscriptions, and we all know that that's in decline. So what are we going to do now to make sure APTN succeeds in the network, succeeds in the world, I should say? Because with reference to this bill, like, APTN like really worked hard to ensure that Indigenous media and Indigenous storytelling were properly represented in this this new Broadcasting Act. And it's important that not only that news and information that is relevant to Indigenous people is provided, but that Indigenous media plays a leadership role, that we're not just an afterthought, we're not just someone to partner with, so you can say that, you know, you're partnering with APTN. It's really needs to be meaningful collaboration where there's that mutual benefit.
Yeah, that's very true. I know there's no it's lean and mean at APTN, but, and really committed to telling stories that otherwise probably would go untold. So, Kenny, I want to ask you, as you know, from where you sit, with Canada's public broadcaster, obviously there are different challenges to the ones and opportunities to the ones that Cheryl mentioned. Obviously on one hand, CBC Radio Canada has the most resources of anybody. On the other hand, it has a mandate that is exceptionally broad and has to serve a lot of different parts of the country, local, national, international, different demographics, you name it. How is CBC confronting those challenges, and how are they innovating to meet the needs of Canadians in this time of continual renewal and industry challenge?
Yeah, thanks for that. And you're right. There's radio transmitters through the country that we maintain, and to make sure we can broadcast over the air, and we maintain terrestrial and linear even as audience shift, right? I mean, the broadcast industry is experiencing North America, in Europe, kind of a version of a cliff that many in the other parts. I've been in publishing, and we watched that cliff a decade plus ago. So we're still keeping that promise because it's still mass reach. And so the question about how do we maintain that and also be relevant to audiences who've clearly indicated that's no longer in their daily habit. Appointment television or radio is not necessarily their habit. So I think back about, how do we innovate in a way that we can be that informed, that we think about the audience's needs and find a way to try it with the outcome of actually landing with audience. So I use the example of, say, podcasting, right? Podcasting is no longer tethered to radio anymore. In the first days of podcasting with iTunes, you simply put radio on downloadable and you're done, right? And I think we all can agree that what's now landed on as a format and how creators, independent and journalism outfits have figured their way into podcasting has been a long journey. And it's something that we have been doing a decade plus. And I think as we look at other types of shifts, whether it's navigating through how do you build a news ecosystem that's driven by search, people looking for answers every day, and Google is your front page, to how does video consumption shift, as Layla was saying. I mean, it's the Instagram generation that wants a vertical video, and the 16:9 doesn't actually make sense for people who have a phone held like that. And so that shifts in a way you gather and create and then distribute. So I think part of it is like, if we're going to make some bets, we got to make it where we can land with, say, an audience segment, younger audiences, and be really, really thoughtful about kind of where are the big touch points. And I think that's kind of the challenge, right? Because we can say newsletters, Patreon accounts, podcasting, and there's just so many opportunities. And you can see within the media industry at large, there are successes in all of those forms. Whether everyone can flood into those areas to be an owner, a market share owner, that's the challenge, right? And I think that for us, it's about understanding our mandate is to be there for all Canadians. And when we think about the younger set, which I talked about, who do no longer have traditional consumption patterns as part of their daily habit, we got to find a way to get to those audiences. So that's where the innovation needs to happen. We don't need to innovate necessarily in live television anymore. Although it's really powerful when we all do it well every day, because it is a draw. But it means we have some emphasis on how do we reach those audiences.
Thanks. Layla, how do you, I mean, you're a new-ish news organization. You're less than a decade old. How do you think about innovation as a startup? This is a different equation than what Cheryl or Kenny would have, or what, some of the things that Ed would mention. You're unencumbered by the burden of being a legacy news operation. So what does innovation mean to you, and how do you make sure you try and stay ahead of the curve here?
Yeah. Well, we're not on TV and we're not on radio. We don't have that benefit at the moment. I don't think it was the intention when we first started, right? We're digital media, and as many other independent media, the goal is to be on the web. So I think that innovation actually happens a lot in North America, but all over the world in small publishers, local news, hyper focused, I think, as Edward said. where we kind of don't really have a choice but to innovate because we're startups, nobody knows us. So how do you create that relationship with people? I think that for us, it's mainly been about relationship building, but also amidst, I mean, C18, you also have to give grace. I think giving ourselves grace to publishers, like we are struggling, I'm not gonna lie, with this ban, and we are trying to find ways to meet our audience, so for us it's been doing more in-person events through our school. So we have a school at La Converse where we trained you to dialogue journalism, and we've divided, not only at the beginning it was only journalism, now we also do rap and podcasting and what we call journalistic rap. So through that we're able to engage more youth in our media, and then we'll have an event, and then they'll come to the event, and then we'll have somebody at the door signing people up to our newsletter. So it's like kind of low-key forcing them, but not really. We're being nice. So getting more people to subscribe to our newsletters. We're working on TikTok. I'm not going to say it's perfect because, there's a specific way to do TikTok. And truthfully, the problem for us, the innovation is there. The problem is, do we have the financial resources to make that? And I think that's been the hardest hit for independent media in Canada, is like, a lot of us are experiencing, I think, the most, the aftermaths of the C18, ban. So like you'll see, like I think just this week or this month, News Media Canada announced that, no, was it Canadian George's Media, I forgot the name, New Canadian Media, that announced that they're right. And so my worries, as I talk to other publishers, we're very much worried about the future. I don't think that innovation is the problem. The problem is, how do you do innovation with very limited funds? And at some point, creativity has its limits without the funds that are being allocated to it.
That's really insightful. Thank you. I want to bring up a topic that we heard about a little bit in Mitch's presentation at the top of this, and also from Colette in her keynote. And this is the issue of trust, and frankly, the crisis of trust that's being experienced by news organizations, not just in Canada, but also in other liberal democracies around the world. To put some meat on the bone, for example, we look at the Reuters Institute report that Colette has produced. Levels of trust in Canadian news organizations have fallen by about 20% or 20 percentage points since 2018. And that decline is also consistent pretty much over both English and French markets. So Leila, I want to ask you, you've, as you just said before, you just launched an English edition. You report on the realities of marginalized communities in order to create dialogue. Can you explain how your outlet is bridging this trust gap with your audiences?
Yeah, well, we take time to begin with. So we do, reporters do one story a week, full time, and we don't rush them. So I think taking the time to, build that relationship with an audience, I ask them as well to really think through, like, what are you doing? What are your motivations? What is this story for? Who is it serving? So I think that, like, asking ourselves questions before we do stories, we ask our community what they want, what kind of stories they want. So we'll have a lot of what I call one-to-ones during the week. So, our staff has to do more one-to-ones with people to ask them, and people they don't know, or community organizers or leaders, or, people that can come to us who can ask us questions. I've just opened office hours. So every end of the month, every last Fridays, people can book a half-hour meeting with me if they have questions about journalism, La Converse, whatever. And I just announced it, I think 2 weeks ago, and I'm already booked until end of November, so just being available to people, I think, is really important. Trying to bring back the person. At La Converse, we also have a transparency note that we publish with every story. So it used to be only on the newsletter. I think just this month, we were able to put it on the actual website. So, people can know why are we writing the story? What were the limitations? What was the process, et cetera, et cetera. These are, like, I think, really important things that you'll see in academia, right? Before you write an academic paper, there's like the preface where the researcher explains, here's why I may not be completely objective. And I always thought that was beautiful. So when I started La Converse, I was like, we need to have those conversations in journalism. So I think from what I know, we're the only publisher in North America who does that. When I've talked to other American publishers and Canadian, nobody does that yet. But that's been really fun. And I know that a lot of audience members really appreciate that. I think it's also not publishing, sometimes less is more. So like, recognizing that there are things that we should not do or we're not equipped to do and that we can't do everything. And so recognizing our limitations when we don't have enough information or when we don't have, the right link with community to write the story. So for us, it's also been about, hiring reporters that stem from the communities we say we want to serve. That's been really important, but when we don't have them available to us, we'll also hire community editors who will participate in kind of validating the story or giving us feedback to really make sure we don't cause harm. So when we look at it from like, we want to restore, we want to repair the harm that's been done by journalists, let's be honest, to many communities. And I think that coming at it from that approach will enable us, or has enabled us so far to really have a much more holistic relationship to journalism and to communities.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your comment earlier about content creators, and I want to go to Cheryl, but could you just elaborate a little bit on how you see that? Because you're saying, journalists can create harm, but also we need journalists at the same time. This is kind of an interesting tension that it sounds like. Could you just explain that a little bit?
Well, I think that if we look at like most of the reporting that's been done on BIPOC communities, vulnerable communities, marginalized communities, for many years, journalism has been harmful, right? Like I come from the Romani community. Most reporting that I saw being done about Roma was extremely traumatic to me. And I've never really seen content that was done where I felt like I was the intended audience member. And I think that's a feeling that's shared across many communities. So I think that, when we talk about people's lack of trust in media, we cannot only blame the guy in Macedonia in his basement doing fake news about Donald Trump. We have to blame ourselves. We have to talk about our biases that we've had as reporters and continue to have when it comes to, doing things from a very colonial perspective. And these are not conversations that we're having in university, and they're certainly not conversations we're having, I'll say often, in media, whether legacy or not. And so, recognizing that to begin with, allows us to then approach people knowing that. So I think that very often it's happened to me, it's happened to our staff where people are like, I don't want to talk to you guys are journalists, right? But when we try to actively repair sometimes the harm that's been done by some of our colleagues when it comes to covering things like trauma, right? And so that's the harmful part. At the same time, right, when we are talking about conflict, war, genocide, things that are happening in various communities, police brutality, etc. If you don't have journalists who are digging up the truth and you only rely on content creators who are not regulated by journalism ethics, I think it becomes a danger to democracy, right? Because these content creators are not obliged to, give, in French is droit de réplique, I don't have it in English, but right to reply, right? Is that it?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you'll see today. A lot of youth will consume, content creation information, I will guess, when it comes to, what's going on in their communities or to get informed. But these people are not regulated. They're not formed as reporters. And I think that, especially if you look at what's been going on in the Middle East, content creators are not journalists, right? And that's a problem. And if they're the only voices that are present on the internet at the moment, well, not on TikTok, but on Instagram, which is where more youth goes to, it's a problem. And then we have elections coming up. We've seen the fake news that were happening in Canadian elections, the previous federal elections. I'm very worried about what is the voice going to be? What is the climate going to be in the upcoming federal elections if we only have content creators out there giving information to people when there's absolutely no regulation,
Okay. Leila, sorry, I'm just a little short. I don't mean to, cut you off there. I just want to make sure that Cheryl and Ed and Kenny are able to weigh in on this sort of thing, because Cheryl, I think, in addition to not being monolithic individuals, Indigenous peoples are spread across the country. To what Ed was saying, not all Indigenous people are located in one particular area. It's very dispersed across the country. And that's a challenge, I would think, for someone in your position, to connecting with Canadians in Tuktoyaktuk, just the same as it is in Rankin Inlet and, I don't know, Thompson, Manitoba. So how do you navigate that, as when you have small bureaus and a limited amount of resources, as you've described earlier?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is it's a huge complexities that we definitely have to deal with every day, because we do need to get out to these communities where people live, so we can talk with people and definitely get more perspectives than you hear, than everybody, everyone hears there's certain voices. So we need to get as many perspectives as we can out there, for sure. Travel is indeed expensive. We took a lot of time and investment into a trip to the high Arctic, and produced some news stories, to produce some podcasts for it. But that trip, that cost us like $16,000, and that's a big dent, in our travel budget, for sure. But we felt it was really important to get up there to those communities. The challenge with also freeing people up to travel is because our newsroom, yes, we have reporters working and they're putting reports out on digital media, but the first reason why APTN News existed is because news and current affairs is condition of license for the whole network. So if we're not producing these mandatory number of hours of news, then APTN will be in violation of its broadcast license. So no matter how many people that we deploy into these communities that have to travel, they're not able to feed because there's no services up there. We'll have to wait till they get back, or we'll have to wait till they can pull off to the side of the road and feed their content by DeGero. We have to be mindful of who we're putting out there, and then who we have left to make sure that we deliver our daily news content for the whole network. I've lost my train of thought on the second part of your question.
No, that's very true. I mean, I think, as you were saying, stories can be costly when you are, dispersed in many different communities across the country, and trying to build trust. A lot of the time people learn to build trust when they see journalists on the ground and in their communities as frontline democracy.
Yeah, if I could just say one more thing toward the trust part, that APTN News, like, we really had to work to make sure that people trust us as professional journalists, for sure. There was a time where, looking back in our archives, where the Assembly of First Nations, I don't want to single them out, there's lots of others, but Assembly of First Nations was literally like, open the door for us, and yeah, come on in, but now it's like, okay, like, closed door, we're not giving you an interview today. We're going to limit the questions. You should only ask about this. And then we're like, well, if we can only ask about this, well, then we're going to pass on that interview, because, we're not going to be bound by just asking people certain questions based on what they want to be asked. That's not where we get our trust. A part of it too has been the ability to invest on the legal side to ensure that we can put these stories out responsibly, but also protect APTN's interests, because we have to make sure that we're sticking to all of the journalism ethics and everything that we can legally report, and invest the money into defending ourselves in court if we have to. And we will go to court if we believe in a story, and that we can, it is the public's right to know that story. And not every news media can do that, can spend the money on the legal so that you can put that story out there, even if you get a lawsuit.
That's great. I realize we're going over time here. Just with if we could extend it with everybody's forbearance for maybe 10 minutes, we just have one more sort of quick round of questions, and then we can, if there are any questions from the audience, I'd be more than welcome to take them for our panelists. And I was thinking a little bit about other jurisdictions and what you've seen in terms of trust building activities or projects or endeavors. Are there any that have been particularly of interest to you that you think, could be adaptable to a Canadian context?
Well, you may be asking the wrong guy, because I think that we tend to spend a little bit of too much time perhaps obsessing about trust. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, and I do think transparency issues are really good. So I'll come back to that in half a second to be dealing with. But trust in journalism cannot be divorced entirely from the breakdown of trust in wider society. It's context.
You just muted yourself, Ed. Sorry.
Have I been off the whole time? There we go.
No.
Oh, okay. Somehow it went off. So I'm concerned about trust in society and the breakdown of trust. And I think, journalism is a subset of that, and shouldn't think that there's something unique about its trust relationships. And the polarization of trust is a real problem. Kenny's gone, but, obviously CBC has a polarization of trust issue, where it's, very deeply trusted by many, many Canadians, and very deeply distrusted by many others. I think the other thing I'd say about trust, well, I'll say two other things. One of the reasons I'm kind of focusing more and more of my just trying to think things through on local is that I think that's a really good place to start to fight polarization of trust. People share communities, and the smaller the community they share, the more that they interact, the more that their kids go to the same school, or they shop in the same places, or have to cross the same unsafe streets, or whatever it may be. So there's a commonality of experience that I think is good to building blocks of trust. When I started as editor of the Globe and Mail, one of the first things I did, probably the first thing I did, is I started a column called Papermaking. We were in the paper business, and we were just starting in the digital business, but we were all mostly in the paper business. And it was to open up our decision-making processes every Saturday to our readers. And this is why we decided this, and this is actually the real debate we had inside about doing it. And like most decisions, it was 55-45, and here's how we came out on it. And it quickly became I don't want to say it was the most popular column in the Globe and Mail. It was the fourth most popular column in the Globe and Mail, and but the other ones ran 3 or 4 times a week. So, readers want to be part of that. They want to be inside. They want to understand why you're doing things. They want to be referenced. Office hours with your readers is a wonderful, is a wonderful idea. And just replying and talking to your readers. Sometimes we would get hundreds of emails when people being angry about something, and I try to answer all hundreds of emails, late into the night. So I think having that relationship also, is good on trust. Trust in other societies is related to, cohesion in those societies. The trust in media is a subset, as I say. So I think it's bigger issues.
Okay. Ed, if I can, I think there's always an elephant in the room when we're talking about public policy and issues like that. And of course, this one that we're facing as an industry is probably the upcoming federal election, whenever that might be. You've done a lot of work and study of public policies, legislation, different initiatives to fund and support quality journalism. If we see a change in power, how do you see some of those policies developing in the future, or not?
Well, everything is going to be, if there's a change in government, everything will be questioned very hard again and have to justify itself again. And it will be justifying itself, having to justify it in face of a more skeptical audience in government than it has now. If you think of, I think there were maybe 3 policies that existed before 2018. And, the CBC is a policy. And Section 19 of the Income Tax Act, which accords special status to, well, it accords normal status, but takes that away from foreign-owned media, is a piece of policy. And the Canadian Periodical Fund. The CBC will be questioned, of course. I don't think Section 19 will be. I don't think that the Canadian Periodical Fund will be too much. But the new policies, of which there was the local journalism initiative, I think that's going to have a hard time surviving the transition, is what I would imagine. There is the best policy of all, in my view, which is the journalism tax credit, and we've heard a lot of skepticism about it, and I'll just come back to that in half a second. We have the charitable status for journalistic organizations. I don't see that going away. It hasn't been exploited as much as it can be yet, but I think it could be a powerful weapon. And even what I've heard today a little bit, social impact investing, charitable investing should be going into new enterprises as they're experimenting. They obviously need capital, and the subscription tax credit has not been a successful policy yet anyhow, and now we have C18. And C18 has a target on its back, and I think it's putting a bigger target on its back because it's putting itself into a bit of a conflict, a potential conflict situation with the governance that's being seen around, and having Google select the collective is a weird concept to me. And having the collective, and both proposals for the collective were the same in this regard. They're both faulty in that they involve self-dealing parties rather than independents. So that's going to put a further target on the back of C18. I imagine. The final point I want to say that I want to circle back to is that if the Conservatives form a government, they are going to find that news is in trouble in the communities that have elected Conservative MPs. I mean, it's already in trouble in communities that have elected Conservative MPs. And those MPs are going to be sensitive to what happens to news organizations in their communities. And, what seems easy now is going to be a little bit more complicated when you're in government. And I expect there'll be some recreation of policy one way or another.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. That's really insightful. I just wanted to end with a question both to Cheryl and Layla about next steps and hope, if I dare may introduce that concept into a discussion about the future of journalism in Canada. However, I just want to think through and ask you both what you see as opportunities to succeed in your respective news organizations in a post-C18 world. Layla, can I start with you, and then I'll go to Cheryl to wrap up.
If I have hope and if I see opportunities to succeed, that's a question.
Yeah, are there areas, opportunities for you to succeed post C18?
Truthfully, I don't know. I'd like to say yes. I feel like we're still, I'm learning less and less to mumble about our Instagram page loss. I used to mumble about it almost every day. So it's almost going to be a year, or it's been a year at this point. We're learning to mourn that loss. But I think it's troublesome, to be honest, because Edward, you mentioned like social impact funding, and it'd be great if we had, philanthropic funding that's as deep and as big and impactful in Canada as we do in the States, where I've just come back from. And, I see a lot of local media outlets serving community, building trust, building engagement that are very well funded. and that are very stable and that are changing actually public policy, and that like have a big impact on communities. But, you know, I get back to Canada and I kind of envy America because we don't have the equivalent here. So, you know, in this world, now that we don't have, you know, this social media, some people are saying, you know what, maybe Meta is going to become MySpace, and then there's going to be, we're kind of all secretly wishing that, let's not lie, in journalism right now. But, you know, maybe there's going to be something that replaces that. Maybe there's new ways for us to build with community. I feel like my hope is like, yes, we are forced to innovate in that sector. I think that people in the rest of the world are watching us and they're like, what is Canada doing? But there are opportunities, I think, to build collaborations between us. And I think like this is also a time for us media outlets to work with each other. I liked how you phrased that in the presentation of this panel, you know, and one thing I've been seeing is like Unrigged, right? So it's a collective of independent media that have gotten together, and, you know, the content is being shared. In Quebec, they're trying to build something. I'm not sure how successful it's going to be. It's called La Nouvelle Place, to create our own social media that you know, mostly like puts forward francophone content. I do think there should be something that we must create, right, to share this content. At the same time, I think that we're also, you know, at La Converse exploring opportunities, whether it is through, you know, text messaging, WhatsApp, TikTok, in person. So like, you know, all the traditional, if I will say, or innovative, as we call them, methods of audience engagement. But I think that to me, the scary part is how are we going to fund all of this? Which was a question before, but it's a more troublesome one post-C18, definitely. And probably more troublesome if we have a certain political party that will be elected in the next federal election.
Brin, could I ask Cheryl and Leila a simple question? Because when you talk about, you know, distribution platforms, so for everybody, distribution is a challenge. We do have a $1.8 billion organization called the CBC at Radio Canada. Would that be a good platform if it was available to you, to both of you?
I think the money that goes to them diverted to APTN would be better, because then we know we're in a leadership position in these editorial decisions.
I would second that. And the problem is, you know, as you said, there are some people that trust CBC and there's some people who don't trust CBC. And I think that where, you know, all of these other media come in place is also, you know, we're not trying to centralize media outlets. So, you know, people will read La Converse for a specific reason, as they will read APTN or can watch APTN. You know, so I think that I don't think it would be a good solution to center everything back to CBC. That's my first guess. I think it would be great if they would share our content, but that shouldn't be the only medium of distribution, right? And then the question is like, how is our audience going to perceive that? You know, because many people who read us, for example, don't necessarily trust legacy media. So you know, their relationship with us is also built about the fact that we're an independent media. And so usually when we do create collaborations, it's going to be with other media that we feel their values align. But if there's not a completely values alignment, it will be hard for us to kind of, you know, build that trust going forward and forward. So that's kind of what I'm thinking today, but I may change my mind tomorrow. What about you, Cheryl?
Yeah,
You both
yeah.
gave me an idea, so
Yeah. I know, like, there's a number of like services that are recognized as they play an exceptionally important role, especially in the broadcasting system. And APTN, of course, is one of them. And, you know, there are others like CPAC, TV5. But with that revenue in decline, part of that solution could be, and I know APTN has said this and at other tables, is to have a designated fund, like a services of exceptional importance fund, that would help in that decline of these services that play an exceptionally important role. Right now, I know that the CRTC is considering the process to expand the funding for that is provided to local television news stations to provide local news, but APTN in many ways is a local television station, albeit we are a national news, we are a national network, but we also play that local news role with Indigenous peoples. Because when we talk about like where there's a news desert, Indigenous peoples aren't necessarily served by a station providing civic journalism where they have one reporter go and report on a banned election. There are too many people being underserved, and like what Colette said about the LJI, looking at it quantitatively as opposed to what's actually being reported and what's being provided for the people. So we do have some ideas on how we can get past this, and now it just remains a question of what is going to happen next.
Well, I don't want to belabor it. I think we've got a topic for another panel here, so maybe tune in next week where we come and solve problems. But for now, Ed, Cheryl, Layla, and Kenny, thank you very much for your time, taking some time out of your afternoon. And also thanks everybody out there for listening in to this conversation. It's a really important one, and we all appreciate your time. So thank you. Mitch, or back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brent, and thank you, Ed, Cheryl, Layla, and Kenny, who is left. It's actually really unfortunate that the panel had to end, because I think we could have had like 3 or 4 hours of content, but alas, I know each of you and Kenny, of course, are very busy, so we'll wrap it up there. But yeah, to our audience, thank you very much for attending today. We hope that some of the insights that have been shared about RSF's Journalism Trust Initiative from Colette's presentation, as well as from our speakers, have been useful and can be applicable into your specific context. If you do have any questions about the JTI, in my case, if you have any questions about the JTI or RSF's work in Canada, please feel free to contact me. I will put my email up on screen at the end. And if you have any questions for our panelists, you can reach them online. So again, we have Brent Jolly, Ed Greenspan, Cheryl McKenzie, Layla Savage, and Kenny Yum. But yeah, thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see more Canadian media engage with the Journalism Trust Initiative, and we hope to see some of these trends reversing, or at least being alleviated in some sense. So thank you very much, and that ends the live stream for today.